In the autumn of 1887, the Territorial Land Office in Astoria, Oregon, posted a notice that no one took seriously. Lot 114C, listed third from the bottom of a page dense with courthouse debts and forfeited homesteads, described a parcel of 9 acres on the Cape headland north of Tillamook Bay, including one stone lighthouse tower 42 feet in height, with attached keeper's cottage, outbuildings in disrepair, and all fixed equipment within. Assessed value was 12 cents. Minimum bid was 12 cents. The auctioneer, a stout man named Corrigan who presided over forfeitures every third Thursday, had read the listing aloud without laughing, only because he was a professional. 12 cents, the price of a small loaf of bread at the Astoria Mercantile, or a single cup of coffee at the Seaman's Rest. Men in the back of the hall had elbowed each other, a lighthouse, for less than a boot polish. What no one in that hall paused to ask was, why? Why would the Bureau of Marine Navigational Aids surrender a functioning aid to navigation at any price, let alone at the cost of a loaf of bread? What debt had finally made the surrender necessary? What the lighthouse itself might contain that the Bureau had decided quietly to let go of rather than investigate? One person asked. Her name was Nora Vance, and she was 28 years old, and she had been standing in the back of the hall in a cream floral pioneer dress and a vivid red wool shawl, holding her late father's surveying journal under her arm, waiting. She bid 12 cents. The hall did laugh. Then she paid, folded the receipt into her satchel beside the journal, and walked out into the salt wind with 9 acres of Cape headland and a 42-foot lighthouse in her possession. What she knew, and what the men in that hall did not, was what her father had told her in the last autumn of his life. He had been a surveyor for the Bureau for 19 years, walking coastlines and headlands from the Columbia River south to Coos Bay, measuring bearings and angles and tide heights, and recording them in leather journals with a hand so steady it barely varied from one year to the next. He had died of a lung illness in the winter of 1884. He had left her 3 journals, his surveying instruments, and the habit of reading coastline records carefully down to their footnotes and corrections. There was one correction he had made twice, in the margin of the 3rd journal in different inks, meaning 2 separate visits. A note about the lighthouse at Cape Lorne. A note about the bearing record. She had sat with that note for 3 years before the auction listing appeared. Her father had not explained the note to her while he was alive. He had been a careful man, and careful men do not put conclusions in margins before they have the evidence to support them. What he had put there were the raw measurements, the coordinates, and the question mark, which she read as a record of a thing he had noticed and intended to return to. The lung illness had not given him the time. After the funeral, she had taken the journals back to the rented room she kept in Portland and spent 3 months reading all 3 of them, front to back and then back to front, in the way he had taught her to read any record, looking first for what it said and then for what it did not. He had surveyed 117 miles of Oregon coastline over 19 years. His measurements were meticulous. When he found a discrepancy in his own notes, he put a small X in the margin and returned to the measurement on the next visit. There were 14 such X marks in 3 journals, and every one of them was followed by a corrected measurement and a date. The Cape Lorne note had no X mark. It had a question mark. That was not his usual notation. The question mark was asking something, not flagging an error in his own work. She had taken the note to a retired coastal engineer. She knew in Portland a man named Boyle who had worked the Columbia River Bar for 20 years and who understood both surveying protocol and the Bureau's internal practices. She had shown him the coordinates and the bearing discrepancy without telling him where the note came from. He had looked at the numbers for some time. Then he had said that a 16-degree divergence between a published table bearing and a field measurement was not the kind of error that came from a careless surveyor. It was either an error in the original table or an error in the field instrument. He said her father's instruments, if they were the ones she had described, were not the kind that made 16-degree errors. She had not said anything more to Boyle. She had thanked him and left. For the next 3 years, she had watched the Bureau's auction circulars. The property at Cape Lorne had not appeared in any of them. It appeared in October of 1887, and she was in the hall at the Astoria courthouse within the week. If you have ever stood at the edge of something the world has discarded and felt the particular weight of knowing what it held, stay close. This story is for you. The lighthouse at Cape Lorne had been decommissioned in 1881, a single paragraph in the Marine Navigational Aid's quarterly record. The reason given was that a newer lighthouse, better positioned and steam-powered, had been completed 9 miles south at Rockaway Point, and the older Cape Lorne installation was redundant. The Bureau had retained the property pending reassignment. 6 years had passed. No reassignment came. In 1887, with a new commissioner who had little patience for encumbered parcels cluttering the ledger, the Cape Lorne lot was moved to surplus and forwarded to the Territorial Auction Office. That was the official account. Nora's father had surveyed Cape Lorne in 1878 and again in 1880. He had measured the tower's base diameter, its wall thickness, the bearing of the lamp room window to true north, and the height of the fixed light above mean high tide. These were standard measurements. He had also, in a margin note in pencil dated September of 1880, written 3 words and a question mark. Then, beneath those words, in a different pencil and a hand that suggested haste, he had written a number, a latitude and longitude, precise to 3 decimal places. Nora had memorized the coordinates. She had plotted them on a nautical chart. They described a location 11 nautical miles offshore, in open water, which would have been directly in the light arc of the Cape Lorne lamp at the time of her father's second visit. There was no navigational hazard at those coordinates. No reef, no shoal, no recorded anchorage. The coordinates described nothing, except that her father had written them twice, in different pencils, as though the first time he had not been sure enough to trust the number, and the second time he had gone back and checked. She hired a wagon from Astoria and loaded it with tools, a set of her father's surveying instruments, a spirit level, a measuring tape, a crowbar, and a wood mallet, a lamp and oil, food for 8 days, a change of clothing. The red shawl, which had been her mother's, and which she wore in all weather because it was warm, and because it was the color she could find on a gray shoreline when she needed to locate herself. The road north from Astoria ran for 11 miles along the coast before turning up toward the headland. The cape itself rose sharply from the surf line, a shoulder of basalt and wind-bent Sitka spruce, and the lighthouse stood at the very edge of it, 42 feet of dressed stone gone dark gray with lichen and salt water. The cottage beside it had lost half its shingles. The outbuildings were collapsed. The iron gate in the stone wall around the complex had rusted at the hinge and stood permanently at an angle, half open, half closed, as though the last keeper had paused there on his way out and been frozen. Nora unloaded the wagon. The last keeper had been gone 6 years. What that meant, in practical terms, was visible everywhere. The kitchen garden had gone entirely to thistle and dock. The water pump at the well had seized and would need soaking before she could work the handle. The cottage windows were filmed with salt, the interior dim in the gray October light, the iron stove cold and the firebox caked with old ash that had gone damp through the chimney and hardened to a paste. The 3 outbuildings were in different stages of collapse, one merely missing its door, one with a roof half-caved by a fallen branch, and one with no roof at all, its walls standing but open to the sky, ferns growing up through the floor planking. She noted each condition in her journal as she walked the property, not because she intended to address them immediately, but because her father had believed that an accurate account of a thing's present state was the necessary beginning of any understanding of what it had been. She had found, on the walk from the coast road up to the Cape, that the headland's position was more dramatic than the Bureau's survey maps had prepared her for. The Cape jutted west into the open Pacific like a shoulder thrown forward, the surf striking the basalt base directly and throwing spray to a height of 30 feet on incoming tide. At the very edge of the cliff, separated from the drop by a low stone wall that had been built by whoever first kept this light and repaired, she could see, at intervals, by whatever keeper came after. The lighthouse tower stood with a solidity that the surrounding decay only emphasized. It had not moved. Whatever the years had done to the cottage and the outbuildings, the tower was as the builder had laid it, plumb and settled, the ashlar courses even, the mortar joints still tight where she pressed her thumb against them. She walked the perimeter of the tower first, hand on the stone. The lighthouse was not a New England frame tower or a Midwest river beacon. It was built on the Cornish model, imported to the Oregon coast by the Bureau's first regional engineer, a man named Aldrich who had apprenticed in Cornwall before emigrating. Thick basalt ashlar, dressed and laid in courses, with a 2-foot wall at the base tapering to 14 inches at the lamp room. No external iron strapping. The mortar was a hydraulic lime mixed with river sand, standard for the period. The tower was structurally sound. 50 years and a salt wind had done nothing to the stone. Her father's note was not about the structure. It was about the bearing. She unlocked the tower door with the key that had been included in the auction packet. A large iron key stamped with the Bureau's mark, which suggested no one had bothered to change it in 6 years. The interior smelled of salt and cold stone and something faintly mechanical, residual oil from the lamp mechanism and the clockwork turning gear that had rotated the Fresnel lens. The lens was gone. The Bureau had removed it before decommissioning, transported south to Rockaway Point, where it still turned. What remained was the iron pedestal, the clockwork drum, and the lamp room housing above, and the fixed iron ladder bolted to the curving interior wall, climbing 40 feet to the lamp room gallery. She climbed. The lamp room was a glass-paned octagon with iron muntins, several panes cracked by weather. The view from it was extraordinary, the full sweep of the Pacific to the west and south, the dark, forested headland to the north, and the broad, shallow bay opening to the southeast. On a clear day, a keeper here could see the water for 15 miles in the lit arc. She stood at the lamp-room window and took out her father's compass. She laid it on the iron pedestal base and waited for it to settle. True, north. She marked it with a chalk line on the pedestal base. Then she took her father's surveying journal and opened it to the page with the second margin note. She needed the bearing he had recorded for the light arc. Every lighthouse on the coast had a documented arc. The sector of water, the lamp swept or covered, expressed as compass bearings to either side of the central axis. The Cape Lorne light was documented in the Bureau's published tables as covering a 140-degree arc centered on 247 degrees magnetic. But her father had noted 231 degrees. Not 247, 16 degrees of divergence. 16 degrees sounds small. On the surface of the ocean, across 11 nautical miles, 16 degrees of bearing offset describes a displacement of over 3 miles. The Bureau's published table said one thing, her father's field measurement said another, and her father did not make errors of 16 degrees. There was a reason to publish an incorrect bearing for a lighthouse arc. She had thought about that reason for 3 years. A ship navigating by the Cape Lorne Light, trusting the published bearing tables, would position itself based on a coverage arc that was offset by 16 degrees from the actual light. In fog, in heavy rain, in a night approach to the bay, a navigator, trusting the published tables, would believe himself to be farther north than he was. The error was systematic, it was consistent, and it had been in the Bureau's published tables since at least 1876, which was the earliest edition she had been able to locate. She climbed down the ladder and sat at the base of the tower in the thin autumn light, with her father's journal open on her knee. He had measured the discrepancy twice in different seasons, and he had recorded the coordinates of the point in open water where a ship trusting the published bearing would believe itself to be at the same moment it was actually approaching the shoal shelf that extended from the Cape's underwater base. The shoal shelf that no published chart named, because it had never been formally surveyed. She had one more measurement to take. The tools she had brought for this were a lead line and a long rope, and a small rented skiff she had arranged to be delivered to the cove below the Cape that afternoon. She spent the rest of the day on the tower measurements, verifying the bearing discrepancy with 3 independent readings at different times, as the sun moved 231 degrees consistently. Then she went down to the cove, stepped into the skiff, and rowed. She had rowed since she was 10 years old, on the river near Portland, where she had grown up. Her father had taught her to use a compass in a boat to track bearing and distance with a watch and a steady stroke rate, to know where she was on a chart by dead reckoning, alone. She rowed for an hour southeast from the Cape, checking her bearing at each quarter mile against the compass, and the lighthouse tower behind her, which she could still see as a gray finger above the spruce line. At the coordinates her father had noted, she stopped and took out the lead line. The lead was a cone of iron on 40 fathoms of marked rope, standard equipment. She dropped it over the side and let it run, counting the marks as they went under. 5 fathoms. 6. The line went slack. She pulled it up and looked at the base of the lead, which was cupped and greased to pick up a bottom sample. The grease held fine gray sand and a trace of broken shell. 6 fathoms at low water, 36 feet, on a coast where the approach to Tillamook Bay required at least 9 fathoms for a loaded barkentine. 6 fathoms was a danger. At the coordinates described in the published Bureau tables as the edge of the Cape Lorne Light Arc, where a navigator would believe himself to be in open water with clear passage south toward the bay entrance, he was instead sitting on a shoal with 36 feet of water over his keel and a rocky bottom 300 yards north of him. She sat in the skiff for a long time, rocking on the small chop, the lead line coiled in her lap. How many ships had navigated that arc she did not know. She would have to go to the Bureau's incident records, to the shipping company logs, to the Tillamook Bay Harbor Master's files. She would have to do that carefully, through channels that gave her no authority and would give her none, because she was 28 years old and a woman, and what she had was a surveying journal and a lead line and 12 cents worth of Lighthouse. But she had those things, and they said what they said. If you have ever counted the cost of a buried wrong and realized that what is owed runs far beyond money, stay with this. She counted it on the skiff, in the afternoon light, on that gray autumn water. She rowed back to the cove. The next 4 days she worked the lighthouse tower and the surrounding property, measuring everything. She resurveyed the base angles, reshot the lamproom bearing from 3 different internal positions using her father's theodolite, which she had learned to operate at his shoulder beginning at age 12, and which she understood, as well as any man who had trained formally at the Bureau School in San Francisco. The readings did not vary. 231 degrees. She documented each reading in a fresh journal, date and time and weather condition, and the specific instrument used, and the calibration check she ran before each reading. She documented the shoal sounding, the bottom sample, the distance and bearing from the tower. She found, in the cottage's back room, a wooden crate that had been left behind when the keeper departed, and inside the crate a collection of old lamp room logs from 1871 through 1880. 9 years of keeper's logs, listing each night's conditions, each vessel sighted in the light arc, and each entry of the arc bearing as the keeper understood it. 247 degrees consistently, from 1871 to 1880. The keeper had not known the bearing was wrong. He had been given a published bearing table, and he had used it. The error had not originated with the lighthouse. It had originated with the table. She carried the crate of logs to the wagon. The work of that day and the next was the careful work of documentation, which her father had described as the only labor that outlasted the laborer. She made a summary table, by year and by quarter, of every night recorded in the keeper's logs, where the arc bearing had been noted. The keeper had not recorded the bearing every night. He had recorded it on nights when visibility was poor enough that he had been tracking vessels by the bearing relative to the light, or on nights when a vessel had passed particularly close to the arc boundary, and he had noted it for safety. There were 87 such notations over 9 years. All 87 read 247 degrees. She compared these against her own 3 field readings from the lamp room window, taken on different days at different times of morning. 231, 231. The instrument in her hands was her father's, the same theodolite he had used for both his 1878 and 1880 surveys. She had checked its calibration against a fixed known bearing before leaving Portland. The divergence was real, and it was consistent, and it had been real and consistent for at least 13 years from the first edition of the Bureau's published tables that she could date to 1874. What she had not yet established, and what she would need to establish before anyone at the Maritime Claims Office would treat the records as serious evidence, was whether the bearing error was large enough, in practical navigational terms, to place a vessel on the shoal shelf she had sounded. She spent the afternoon working through the geometry, using the trigonometric tables her father had kept in the back of his second journal. The calculation was not difficult. It was exact. At the published bearing of 247 degrees, a vessel approaching the bay from the northwest in reduced visibility and using the light as a position reference would, at the moment it believed itself, to be at the arc boundary, and therefore in safe water to the south, actually be positioned approximately 3¼ miles south of that belief, which placed it on the charted edge of the Cape's underwater shelf. The shoal she had sounded from the skiff was at the center of that displaced position. She wrote the calculation out in full and copied it twice. She carried the crate of logs to the wagon. He was old, 70s at least, with a weathered face and a limp from a left leg that had been broken and poorly set. His name, he told her, was Gideon Marsh, and he had been the keeper of Cape Lorne from 1869 to 1881. He had heard, through the Astoria postmaster, that someone had purchased the Lighthouse. He had come to see what kind of fool had bought it. He stood in the gate and looked at her for a moment. She offered him coffee, which she had been making on the cottage's iron stove, and he accepted. He told her about 3 ships, not in direct sequence, not with clear dates at first. He told her the way an old man tells things he has not spoken aloud in a long time, circling, testing whether the listener could bear the weight. She listened without hurrying him. She refilled his cup The first ship was the Barkentine Carver, October of 1875, lost on the shoal north of the Cape in a night approach. Cargo of lumber and dry goods, crew of 8. 3 of the 8 did not make it to shore. The Maritime Inquiry at Astoria had attributed the loss to navigational error by the master. The master had been dead, drowned in the surf. He could not speak for himself. The second ship was a revenue cutter, 1878. It had grounded briefly on the same shelf, struck and backed off without loss, and filed a report with the Bureau. Gideon had been told by the Bureau's district supervisor that the report had been forwarded to San Francisco for review. He had never heard a result. The third ship was the schooner Patience, November of 1880, 2 months after her father's second visit to the tower. Cargo of livestock and hardware, bound for Garibaldi. Lost in fog, all cargo lost. Captain and mate injured, crew survived. Maritime Inquiry again cited navigational error. The captain had contested the findings, citing the bearing tables. Gideon Marsh set down his cup. He said that he had filed his own report after the Patience. He had written to the Bureau's San Francisco office, describing his concern that the bearing table for the Cape Lorne arc was incorrect, that the shoal to the northeast was not adequately charted, that he believed the published tables were placing ships at risk. He had signed his name and his title, Headkeeper, Cape Lorne Lighthouse, and he had received in return a letter from a Bureau official named Caldwell, which said that the tables had been reviewed and confirmed accurate, and that further correspondence on the matter would not be productive. He had kept the letter. He showed it to her. The letter was dated December of 1880, 2 months after the Patience went down, 3 years before the lighthouse was decommissioned. She took the letter carefully, held it to the light, read it. Then she read it again. She folded it and set it on the table between them. Gideon Marsh said that he had served 12 years on that cape, and he had never gotten the measure of the shoal from the waterside. He said that if she had done it, and her record stood, she had done something he could not. He told him about the lead line. She told him what she had found. He said nothing for a while. Then he said that 3 of the 8 men from the Carver had wives in Tillamook. He said one of them, a woman named Delia Foss, was still there, and that the family had never received any maritime settlement, because the official finding was that the loss was the master's fault. Nora wrote the name in her journal. She spent the next 2 days completing her survey documentation. On the morning of the 8th day, she loaded the wagon. She put in the crate of keeper's logs, her own survey journal, the letter from the Bureau official Caldwell, Gideon Marsh's letter, her father's 2 journals, and the survey notes from the current visit signed and dated. She also packed the lead line and the bottom sample sealed in a glass jar she had brought for the purpose. Gideon Marsh stood at the gate as she finished loading. He asked where she was going. She said she was going first to Tillamook to find Delia Foss, then to the Maritime Claims Office in Portland, then, if necessary, to the Bureau of Marine Navigational Aid's regional office in San Francisco. He said it would not be easy. She said she knew. He said that the man named Caldwell had retired in 1885, and that the current district supervisor was a younger man, from what he understood, and that the new superintendent was said to be uncomfortable with matters left unresolved. She noted that down. He asked if he could do anything. She said he had already done it by keeping the letter. The road from the Cape to Tillamook was 20 miles south along the coast, and she made it in a long day. Tillamook, in the autumn of 1887, was a dairy town and a fishing settlement, with a harbor bar that kept large vessels out and a community that knew the sea in the way of people who had watched it take things they could not get back. She found the address she was looking for on the second morning, a small frame house near the dairy cooperative, with a kitchen garden gone brown for the season. Delia Foss was 61 years old. Her husband, Martin, had been a carpenter aboard the Carver, working his third coastal passage, saving money to buy a home lot. She had a son who had her husband's hands and her husband's name and who had never met him. She told Nora this at the kitchen table with a directness that asked for no pity and received none. Nora spread the survey documents on the kitchen table. She explained what the record showed, not quickly and not slowly, but in the order that made the evidence legible. The bearing discrepancy, the shoal sounding, the keeper's report and the Bureau's reply, the three vessels. Delia Foss looked at the letter with the Bureau's letterhead for a long time. Then she looked at Nora's survey notes. Then she looked at Nora. She said, "My husband was a careful man." The inquiry said the master. I did not believe that for a single day. Nora said she knew. She said that was why she was here. She went to Portland in the second week of November. The Maritime Claims Office was housed in a building that smelled of pipe smoke and damp wool, and the clerk on duty looked at her as men in offices tended to look at women who arrived with document crates and did not preface their business with an apology. She set the crate on the counter and asked to speak with the claims superintendent. The superintendent's name was Archer. He was 40, methodical, and had the look of a man who had spent years untangling other people's mistakes. She laid the materials before him in order. He did not interrupt her. He asked 3 questions, all of them technical, about the theodolite calibration and the lead line protocol and the provenance of the keeper's logs. She answered each question fully. He looked at the letter from Caldwell for a very long time. He said he would need to retain the materials for review. She said she had made copies, which was true, carried in a separate satchel as a precaution. Her father had drilled into her from the beginning. Never give a record office your only set. He received the originals. She kept the copies. She returned to Astoria and to the Lighthouse. There was work to do on the property. The cottage needed its roof, and she had the skills for it, her father having been the kind of man who believed a surveyor should also be able to lay shingles. He had carried a small toolkit on every field survey, wedge and hammer and a folding rule, and he had repaired the roof of their Portland house twice over her childhood, teaching her to work from the ridge down to lap each course correctly, to seat the nails so the head sat flush and no moisture could enter under the cap. She had not done it in 4 years. The physical memory of it returned in the first hour, her hands finding the rhythm before her mind had finished accounting for the motions. She worked through November and into December. The Oregon coast in those months is not a comfortable place, the storms coming off the Pacific in long gray processions, the wind at the Cape edge constant enough that she tied the red shawl flat over her hat on days when she was working at height. The cottage roof took 3 weeks. After it, she addressed the well pump, soaking the cylinder joints with lard oil over 2 days until the handle freed enough to be worked. The water that came up first brown, and then, after an hour of pumping, clear. After the pump, she turned to the outbuilding with the salvageable walls, cutting salvage planks for a new floor, and sourcing replacement shingles from a mill in Astoria that was able to have them delivered by wagon. The waiting was the hardest part, not because she doubted the evidence, but because she knew what happened to evidence when it passed through the hands of institutions that had reason to be cautious about what they confirm. She had given Portland the originals. She trusted Archer's methodical manner more than she trusted the institution he served, and she thought that trust might be sufficient. She was not certain. On the nights when the uncertainty was loudest, she went up to the lamp room and stood at the window in the dark. The lamp was not lit. The room was cold and the wind pressed against the glass, and the ocean below was a sound more than a sight, the surf on the basalt a continuous percussion she had begun to know in the same way she knew the rhythms of familiar work. She was not frightened of the dark from up there. She was waiting in the way her father had described, waiting which was not passive but active, the kind of attention that holds a question open without forcing it to close before its time. The inquiry took 4 months. In March of 1888, the Maritime Claims Office in Portland issued a formal finding. It described the bearing table discrepancy for the Cape Lorne light arc as a systemic documentation error originating in the Bureau's 1874 coastal survey, conducted by a contracted team under the supervision of the district engineer. The contracted team had reused bearing data from an earlier survey of a different cape 18 miles north, applied it to Cape Lorne without field verification, and submitted the erroneous figure as confirmed. The district engineer, a man named Aldridge, which was the same name Nora's father had noted as the lighthouse's original designer, had signed the approval. Aldridge had died in 1882. The error had persisted in every edition of the published tables from 1874 to 1887, the year the lighthouse had been decommissioned, and the tables had been retired without correction. The finding named 3 vessels. It named the Carver, the revenue cutter, and the Patience. It overturned the navigational error findings against the Carver's master and the Patience's captain. It directed the Bureau to issue corrected bearing documentation for the historical record. It authorized the Maritime Claims Office to open a review of the settlement record for each vessel, with attention to any surviving crew or family of crew whose claims had been resolved on the basis of the overturned findings. It also noted, in a paragraph near the end, that the shoal shelf north of Cape Lorne had been formally surveyed for the first time by a private surveyor in October of 1887, and that the results had been forwarded to the Coastal Hydrographic Survey Office for incorporation into the current nautical charts. The private surveyor was identified only as a licensed surveyor operating from the Cape Lorne property. Nora read the finding on the cottage porch with her father's journal open on her knee, in the first clear morning after a week of rain. There is a thing that happens when a buried wrong finally surfaces. Not in the way of drama, but in the way of a tide going out and leaving the shape of the bottom visible for the first time. The bottom has always been there. It is not new. What is new is that the air touches it at last. The Foss family received a settlement review from the Maritime Claims Office in April of 1888. The review determined that Martin Foss's death had occurred as a result of a navigational hazard that the Bureau had known or should have known, and which the Bureau's own keeper had reported, and which had not been acted upon. A settlement offer was made. Delia Foss accepted it and declined to discuss the sum. She wrote one letter to Nora, 4 lines, the handwriting very straight. She wrote only, "My son now knows his father was not to blame." The Bureau's current district supervisor, the younger man Gideon Marsh had mentioned, traveled to Cape Lorne himself in May of 1888 to view the tower and speak with the woman who now held the property. He was courteous and not comfortable, which was the correct proportion. He asked whether she intended to sell the property back to the Bureau. She said no. He asked what she intended. She said she had found a use for the tower. She said the property sat at the most prominent coastal headland between Astoria and Tillamook, that the new light at Rockaway Point did not adequately cover the northern approach to the bay in heavy fog, and that the Cape Lorne Tower was in good structural condition and occupied a superior position. She said she had a proposal for a formal navigational contract, private operation under Bureau license, the kind of arrangement that had been used on the eastern coast since the 1822. He told her he would have to take that to San Francisco. She gave him a copy of the proposal, neatly written, with the bearing measurements and the fog day frequency data she had collected over the preceding months. and the cost estimate for restoring the lamp room. He took the proposal and left. He was back on the headland in August of 1888, and the contract was signed in September on the cottage table, with Gideon Marsh as a witness because she had written to him and he had made the trip from wherever he had been staying in Astoria, still limping, still correct about everything. The lamp was relit on the 14th of October 1888 at the bearing of 231 degrees. The first keeper under the new arrangement was Nora Vance, operating under the Bureau license. She would hold that position for 11 years, until she handed operations to a successor she had trained herself. The nautical charts issued by the Coastal Hydrographic Survey Office in 1889 included, for the first time, a notation for the shoal shelf north of Cape Lorne, charted from her lead-line survey. The notation read in the margin column, reserved for survey credits, 4 words and a date: sounding survey, October 1887 N. Dance. Gideon Marsh came back to the Cape in the spring of 1889. He said the sea air was better for his leg than the Astoria streets. He stayed on through the summer as an informal assistant, tending the fog bell and the gear, which he knew better than anyone alive. He never called himself anything. He just came. If you have stood in a place where a wrong was buried and felt the weight of knowing, it was there. You know what it cost her to carry that knowledge for 3 years before she had the means to surface it. The means was 12 cents. The work was everything else. Leave a word below if you know that weight. And if a story about a woman who measured what others ignored is the kind of story that keeps you close, there is another one waiting. Patient, specific, and earned. Exactly like this. The lighthouse stands at Cape Lorne still, or a version of it does. The stone courses her father surveyed and she measured, and the Bureau repaired and lit again. The nautical chart with her name in the margin has been superseded by 3 subsequent editions. Her name is in none of the newer ones. The instrument she used to take the bearing that overturned 4 maritime findings and corrected 13 years of published tables was a brass surveying theodolite, mid-century manufacture, with a vernier scale graduated to 20 seconds of arc, and a worn mahogany case with her father's initials pressed into the lid. She kept it on the shelf in the lamp room for all 11 years. She kept the light. When she left, she took it with her. The case sat, for many years after her death, in a storage room of the Tillamook County Historical Society, uncatalogued, labeled in pencil on a paper tag that read, "Surveying Instrument, Origin Unknown." Someone would eventually open the case and read the initials. The truth is, patient that way.